looks like we've got a really good turnout now, so I think it's good to start. So hi everybody, welcome to tonight's session where we'll be speaking about political mindfulness. So this is the second in a series of events around the topic of mindfulness and politics. The first was last week, and as Phil will give a bit more information about that in a second, but it was actually recorded. So Compass have been helping to convene these sessions, and we're working on the recording right now, which means that everybody then will be able to see it and listen to it and experience that when it goes up on the website, which should be in the next week or two. So there's also to point your attention to two other publications, which you might have already read in preparation for this. So the first publication, which we were looking at last week and really focusing on in that context, was Political Mindfulness, Fresh Perspectives on Multiple Crises. And we had a number of the authors here speaking about their contributions to that publication last week. And then this week, we've had fresh off the press today, has gone out online. There must be somewhere out of here by Phil, mapping the pandemic from left field. And that's a companion piece to the first, which is published at the same time and kind of looks at a range of political and personal responses to the pandemic, and draws on the same kind of culture and thinking around psychoanalysis and the benefits of mindfulness around that. So I really recommend both papers. I found them really, really insightful and really original. I'd never really considered the implications and the intersections of politics and mindfulness. I myself have also done a mindfulness course and practiced mindfulness for a few years and found it really useful. And I think quite a number of the contributors to the first publication had said that themselves that they had both been politically active and had been involved in mindfulness in some way, but hadn't really not necessarily brought the two into relationship with each other. So I was fascinated to explore those differences and lots of things which I hadn't really considered about the ways in which this might be brought to bear on certain political issues or help shift our political culture to a sort of more compassionate and more inclusive and more thoughtful way of doing politics. So I got a lot out of this publication and I'm really excited for tonight's event. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm constantly adding people to the waiting room. Got another 10 people just joining now. If you could ask everybody to just keep yourselves on mute if you're not speaking. So only the speaker really should be unmuted. It's just to avoid any sort of background noise or interference from our side. As I said, we're going to try and we definitely will finish on time. And we're also very keen to have a proper discussion with a lot of you, because I know that a lot of people on the call, we've got some speakers from last week, and we've got a lot of you who've joined who have experience and insight into these issues. So we definitely want to bring in a lot of people through the call. So I'm going to be quite strict with speakers. They have 7 minutes each. And after we've heard speakers, we're going to open up to a broader audience. I'll take probably some questions one at a time and feedback to the speakers, but you're welcome to also just put your H in the chat or put a little note in the chat if you'd like to speak. So the chat you can find at the bottom of your screen, it says chat, and it opens up on the right hand side. If you want to speak at any time during the question and answer session, just put a little H in the chat. I'd ask you to put an H in after the speakers has finished the first section. But if you want to make any sort of comments or add a link or just respond to what the speakers are saying in real time, feel free to use the chat as well. I think that's all on the gatekeeping issue. As I said, we will definitely be finishing on time, if not a little early, because it's quite warm evening, and I know that everybody would probably like to get a bit of vitamin D or certainly take a drink of water at the end of this. So thanks all for turning out this evening when I know you could be sitting in your garden melting like I was just before this. So I think without further ado, we're going to kick off with Phil. So Phil is the kind of prime mover of this whole this whole series and the publications as well. So massive thanks for Phil for making this happen. And this is something that's new to Compass and Compass's territory, but really excited to have these publications and have these two accompanying series of events as well. So I'm going to leave Phil to explain a little bit about maybe the background to this, how this came about, and maybe to introduce the papers as well. You have 7 minutes, Phil, and then we'll move you on to the next speaker as well. Thank you.
Without hesitation, pause or contradiction, I suppose. Well, thank you very much, Francis, and thank you very much for chairing this event, and also to Compass for supporting this initiative and making these publications. Okay, so I thought for those of you who didn't attend last week's event, I'd just give a bit of the background to this project and the two publications. Apologies to those who were here last week, but I'll make it brief anyway. So it began with a kind of launch event way back in January, which seems like another long time ago, for a book that I'd put together entitled Waypoints Towards an Ecology of Political Mindfulness. Valerie Walkerdine and Dick Pountain were part of that discussion panel, along with Ruth Lister, who spoke last week, and also Lynne Segal. So it's a bit of a reunion tonight. So last week, as Francis said, we focused on the issue of political mindfulness, how far we can push the notion of mindfulness to extend its scope, both intensively and extensively, and make new connections between the personal and the political, and how that might help us get a handle on the multiple crises we're living through. So now this week, we're looking at more substantive issues, the crisis of labourism, environmental crisis, and the biopolitical crisis around COVID-19, how this has created a space for both feminist and anti-racist intervention. And so to address these issues, we're delighted to be joined by Lynne, who was on the original Waypoint panel, and also by Ashwani Sharma. Now, in the companion piece to this collection, which Francis just mentioned, I've written an essay which, as she said, looks at the impact of the pandemic for what it tells us about the kind of society and culture we live in. The government likes to tell us that their policies are just following the science. But the issue for me is whose science and what kind of science. It's clear that the Exiteers are being driven by a largely political agenda. Like the Brexiteers, with whom I think they have much in common, they have a kind of Merry England vision of an island nation securing its borders, throwing off the yoke of lockdown, and resuming a triumphant trajectory towards the ever sunlit beaches of Forestful-on-Sea. If you look at the headlines of the Tory press this morning, I think you'll get a sense of how they're playing that.
Phil, sorry to interrupt you. Could you just hold your microphone also a little bit closer to your mouth? Sometimes it's sort of phasing in and out. It's always not easy.
Is that better?
It's a little bit, yeah, it's a little bit better. Sorry, I know that might be a bit annoying. Just
yeah, unfortunately, the microphone on my laptop is terrible, so I'm having to do this thing. Is that better?
It's a little bit. It sometimes moves in and out, but I think if you keep it quite steady, it should be okay. We're picking up most of what you're saying.
All right, okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
So the point that I'm making in my piece is that, okay, COVID-19 is a communicable disease, and it follows its own rules. Okay, well, the government strategy is informed by a rational choice theory of risk, which is underpinned by nudge economics. It's a model which assumes that given proper health messaging, individual citizens are incentivized by self-interest to make rational decisions about risk and thus ultimately responsible for their own health outcomes. Now, that model fits perfectly within the neoliberal health agenda, but it doesn't remotely correspond to the complexity of real-life situations which many people find themselves in, where they face impossible choices between equally difficult and risky situations and find themselves being pulled emotionally in several directions at once. Now, to understand what is at stake there, I think we have to draw, or at least what I've done anyways, to draw on some of the insights and perspectives of the human sciences, and in particular psychoanalysis and anthropology. So in my essay, I explore some of the different ways risk is perceived and acted upon, or ignored, mapping out a kind of emotional geography, in particular distinguishing between people whose model of the world is basically it's a safe place with a few dangerous or thrilling hotspots in it, and those for whom, conversely, the world is a basically dangerous and hostile place with a few safe niches or bolt holes to which they cling for dear life. So in the essay, I look at how these emotional dispositions might shape people's responses to COVID, and in particular to lockdown. But at the same time, these responses, which are first learnt from parents and peers, are a function of the kind of symbolic or material control which people exercise over their environment. And obviously that's affected by factors like class, ethnicity, gender, and age, as well as local situational factors. So the second part of the argument is, in order to map the political dimensions of these personal orientations, these emotional takes on it, I've drawn on the work of an anthropologist, Mary Douglas, who's developed a very interesting cultural theory of risk. I mean, it was influential in the 1980s, her theory, and it's been largely forgotten today, but I think it's very relevant to the present crisis. For Mary Douglas, perceptions and responses to health or environmental risk are a function of the degree and type of social and cultural capital at people's disposal, how much or little confidence or trust they can afford to have in social and political institutions, and what kind of cultural resources they can draw on in representing their relationships to other people and to power structures. So in the essay, I built on this model, linked it to the kind of psychoanalytical view of these emotional orientations, and outlined 4 existential standpoints towards risk, which I've called authoritarian, libertarian, communitarian, and fatalistic. And in the essay, I try and draw out the implications of each standpoint for how different groups have responded to COVID-19 and to the measures taken to manage it. So yes, as Compass folk like to say, it's bloody complicated. And it underlines the fact that one-size-fits-all approaches to tackling the pandemic are likely to fail. Issuing categorical imperatives, stay home, save the NHS, backed by legal sanctions, only works as long as everyone either agrees or is forced to obey them without exception. So, for example, with masks, I mean, if everyone wears the mask, then they're kind of effective. If some people do and some people don't, it isn't. Now, the point about categorical imperatives is that they're uncomplicated because they take no account of differences in individual circumstance, unlike what Kant called hypothetical imperatives, which are subject to negotiation, take into account locally situated meanings, and can more easily get active consent. Now, one reason why the government's health messaging has been so confused is because it continually veers between the 2 kinds of imperatives, between the categorical and the hypothetical, and the authoritarian and libertarian positions which underpin them. So that's one kind of complication we have to try and unravel. The second, which I explore, is the way existing social and cultural inequalities not only become more transparent, more visible, but are more condensed as they're refracted through a new kind of biopolitics, new ways of defining, surveying, and controlling populations of the healthy and the sick. And in the essay, I look at the way COVID-19 is replaying the generation game and also at the racial profiling of BAME communities. Finally, the essay looks at the implications of all this for the Labour Party, in particular for its relationship to a new political actor which has emerged through the pandemic, and which I call the hands-on working class. Whether they're handling people or goods or the tools of various trades, they have found themselves on the front line in the most risky situations. Their labour has for so long been disregarded and underpaid, perhaps unsurprisingly given that so much of it is done by women and by members of the BAME community. This work has now been widely recognised as of decisive importance to the maintenance of the fabric of civil society. This transvaluation of labour values must surely lie at the core of the Labour Party's programme of recovery, both its own recovery as a viable force of opposition to the Tories, and for the communities which have mobilised long dormant forms of collective enterprise and mutual aid in responding to the crisis, which have nevertheless become disconnected from organised politics and the metropolitan left. We need an exit strategy which gets us out of the current moral panic focused on high-risk carriers, the new untouchables, and builds on this emergent moral economy, builds it into a new political economy in which the health of the body politic is conditional on the well-being of the many and not the few. So that's my pitch and my spiel. Okay.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for persisting despite all that. Kind of keeping a closer eye on the waiting room now and trying to also just mute anybody who comes in who shouldn't be here. So I think the next speaker was Valerie. Valerie, you're up next. 7 minutes. Thanks for keeping us time as well, Phil, despite everything.
Thanks very much. Well, I'm just going to make a few comments about what I wrote. The whole piece is really a set of notes. There isn't an overt argument in it, but a set of observations and notes about in South Wales, particularly the valleys and London, up to the 2019 election and beyond, and then going backwards in South Wales to before Brexit. And I just want to make one or two comments about the way I've been thinking about it. So, and I deliberately didn't there make an argument, because I just wanted the cumulative effect of the observations to do something. So I've been living and working in South Wales, near to the valleys, for some years, and through several research projects and working with working class PhD students from the valleys, it became clear well before Brexit that there was huge distress at deindustrialisation. I did some work around 2007 and 2008 that particularly brought that up, producing poverty in the area which lacked decent work and transport links. These things are well known, but people were used to working where they lived. And this is how communities were set up, because they're often set up in relation to workplaces, and supported each other in a very familial kind of way. Many people talked about the community as a large family. So entrepreneurialism was a complete anathema, because it implied competition and not the close cooperation that had actually kept people going for a long time. So I think it's not too much to say that this produced trauma which followed the end in one community that I worked with particularly for 200 years of iron and steel, with the steelworks razed to the ground within a month. So there was a gap, a hole at the centre of this community. You know, when no help came from the regions, bitterness and despair set in. Dislike of all forms of government began to be expressed, feeling rejected, not heard, abandoned by all governments, regional, national, EU. The desire for self-determination, again and again and again mentioned, to be heard, actually, to be heard. It was always to be heard. And in the valleys, it's this that drove the vote for Brexit, so easily manipulated by the right, that since Thatcher has managed to tap into class issues that Labour seemed increasingly to ignore. So trauma, pain, abandonment, fury, and it failed to be addressed by the Welsh government after Brexit, despite claiming to be listening. So a huge class divide opens up with a middle class increasingly pathologizing precisely these kinds of people because of their views on Brexit and right-wing support. But I am trying to say that the right did what the right does. The right took these concerns, which didn't necessarily belong to the right, and did something with them, because they were the only ones talking about them. So I kept asking, why is nobody still listening? Why are platforms put forward that seem not to have listened, or any that appear to let working class people in these situations lead? So although in South Wales most people in the valleys felt they couldn't vote Tory, they did in other places like Wrexham, and of course in deindustrialised communities in England, what became what we now know as the Blue Wall. So who listened? How come some in the end felt so not heard that they voted for Brexit again in the form of voting for a Tory victory? I think it doesn't help at all to consider such communities as right-wing. More that, as I've been trying to say, the right recognised and played unmercilessly upon the fears and history, manipulated it for all its far-right worth. The class divide is so entrenched. Look at who, and as Phil said, look at who worked at home during the pandemic and who worked ceaselessly, usually never stopping, because people needed to work if they could. Not all of them could, but if they could, they needed to work, because by this time most people are not employed by big employers and can be furloughed. It may be too late to listen now, but at least giving up classist assumptions about the other and actually hearing what they are trying to tell us would be a start. And that's all I want to say, really.
Brilliant. Thank you, Valerie. And I think that was really...
Ooh,
it was really
everybody's gone still.
Yeah, well, I was about to say to everybody as well, just in case of future bombing, I have got everybody to mute yourselves. So it puts me in a bit of a weird position because I have to unmute you to be able to speak. But we'll just go in the speaker order, and then of course when we get to the questions, you can put yourself in the frame by putting an H in the chat or raising your hand, and then I can unmute you as we go. But thanks, Valerie. I think that ties together really effectively also what Phil was saying, but also having that backward glance, I think, on what happened is just a few years ago, even though it feels like much longer, is a really interesting perspective to have to continue, because I think those issues and those questions are still with us now as we grapple with this current crisis. It's not really gone, you know, it's still in the picture. So I'm going to ask Dick to speak next, and this should work if I unmute you, Dick. That should have worked. Are you with us? Brilliant. That's great.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
You've got a little bit of a delay on the line, but maybe that'll go away as you start speaking.
Yeah, okay. Well, I wrote my contribution to the Fresh Perspectives collection a week or so before the lockdown began in March. And in April, Phil offered me the option of revising it in the light of the COVID emergency. But I declined his offer and merely added a footnote explaining the timing of the piece. And that's basically because my piece was about climate change and its implication for strategies on the political left. And however horrible the COVID crisis may feel right now, the fact is that those same implications will remain in force after COVID goes away, even if it takes several years to go away, which is seems quite possible. In my article, I argued that Labour supporters' hopes for a 1945 style victory in the 2019 election were dashed because Attlee's government was propelled to power on a wave of social solidarity that was generated by the shared hardships of fighting World War II. And such a degree of solidarity can no longer be relied upon. And the reason it can't be relied upon is that a succession of Tory governments, ever since Thatcher's in '79, set out deliberately and ideologically to erode that solidarity in favour of acquisitive individualism. And they've had enormous success in doing so. The highly effective measures that they used included privatizing public utilities, deliberately failing to intervene in the collapse of manufacturing industry, running down public transport in favour of the motor car and more road building, and the sale of council housing. The total effect of all those measures combined over the last 30 years have been to lead to a reduction of the influence of trade unions, enormous house price inflation.
Sorry to interrupt. We're having a little bit of
the younger generation out of
I think there's quite a lot of delay.
ownership.
Dick, I wonder if you could turn off your video function.
Air pollution as a result of that.
Aha.
Crisis of homelessness. Yes.
I've got a 5-minute delay on this right now. No, we just have to listen to me saying that all again. Yeah, if you turn off your video, I think that might work a little bit better. Yeah, because I think it's a delay on the line. So let's try that now. Let's try that now.
I've turned off video. I've turned off video.
Great. Give it a go now. It's just the delay.
Are you still getting the delay now?
No, it's much better now. It's just that you were hearing what I was saying about a minute ago. Apologies for that. Have a go.
Did you hear anything of what I said before?
Yeah, but it might be worth just picking up where you were about a minute ago before the delay happened. That'd be great.
About a minute ago, okay.
Thanks.
Taken together, all the measures that Tory governments brought in over those 30 years led to reducing the influence of trade unions and membership of trade unions, enormous house price inflation, traffic congestion in the cities with severe air pollution as a result, crisis of homelessness, and perhaps most important of all, an ever-widening generation gap between affluent parents of the baby boom generation and their underemployed children and grandchildren, whose futures are the ones that are most threatened by climate change, and therefore are the ones that are most active in the climate change movement. So, is it possible that the collective suffering we're all experiencing under coronavirus lockdown might restore some of that lost sense of solidarity? Well, I watched Anthony Barnett's excellent Compass talk last night via Zoom, and I share his guarded optimism about the potential for change in our current situation. In particular, Anthony singled out the fact that it was a swell of popular feeling that forced this government to abandon its pursuit of herd immunity and put human lives before the economy. However, where I perhaps part from him is that I can see 3 ways in which the virus is likely to make matters worse. The first of these is that it's already further widening the generation gap because of the character of the virus itself, that it has a milder effect and lower lethality on young people. And I get a feeling that quite a lot of them are coming to see themselves as being locked down and deprived of jobs to protect an older generation that already has all the advantages, and they're starting to resent it. The second factor is that the mass layoffs that lockdown
Oh no, don't say we've lost you entirely now. Dick, can you still hear us?
has been promising them in the long term. The third factor, and the one that affects me most because I work in the computer business, or I write in the computer business, is that the giant US digital corporations like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Uber, and the rest have vastly increased their social influence and their turnover during the lockdown. and the position of power that they were already in has been magnified enormously, and it will inflict enormous damage to employment in older types of retailing, hospitality, and entertainment industry. So given all these three factors together, if we're going to think about any sort of new Green New Deal, we're going to have to go very far beyond merely advocating a return to growth-led Keynesian economics, which is essentially what the last Labour manifesto was about. What we have to face up to is the prospect of attempting to build a post-work society that uncouples income from full-time employment. That means some form of universal basic income, which Compass is already highly committed to. Universal basic income will be necessary, but not sufficient. The first task is that we have to distinguish a radical left universal basic income from a meaner form of universal basic income that some people on the right are already quite keen on. They see UBI as a minimally funded means of pacification that will free up super rich elites to secede into their own separate, luxurious private domain and produce a sort of kind of cyber feudalism, if you like. In order to define what a radical UBI might look like, we need to explore ways in which radical governments might tackle the power of the digital corporations. 50 years ago, we would have said nationalize them, but it's clearly not possible. They're actually bigger than most nations already. They're more likely to buy us than we can buy them. Instead, we have to find inventive ways of making them pay up, assuming that a left-wing government, or at least a progressive government, can come to power again in the USA and the UK. That government would have the ability to threaten them with breakup, particularly in the USA. They could go back to the breakup of the monopolies in the golden, the turn of the 19th century. If you threatened the digital corporations with breakup, unless they were all prepared to pay into a UBI fund, and also if you were to levy some of the time on their incredibly effective infrastructures that they would donate for use for social good, for example, for reorganizing National Health Service and so on. Their infrastructure is more efficient than any communication system that's ever existed on the planet, but they use it entirely for profit. If you could make them give a certain amount of that infrastructure up for the use for social good, in part payment of the taxes that they currently evade, that might be one way of harnessing their power. Once a UBI system is working effectively, then the labour power freed up by it would have to be applied into some sort of new public works administration to implement the huge structural changes that we're going to need if we're going to ever get close to a carbon neutral economy.
in the slot allotted to questions. And so I'm going to carry on with the speakers now. And Ash, you're up next. So I will unmute you, and do feel free to just jump straight in. If we have any tech problems, I'll just be able to. That should be working now. Give it a test.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Brilliant, yeah.
Is that right?
Loud and clear, that's perfect. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, good afternoon, good evening. It depends what part of the world you're in, I think. Thanks, Phil, for the invitation to contribute to this event. I wasn't part of the original publication, and I haven't got, this is not a written paper, it's anything, it's just a few notes. As I'm an interlocutor, and in a way I want to just add to what has already been discussed, but focus on questions of race, racism, blackness and Black Lives Matter, arguing that it's at the limit of the political and democratic politics. So I'm just going to, given the time, I'm just going to make 5 points really, and then we can talk about them later. One is, I can't breathe is a gasping cry for life, for black life. The police killings are proclaiming that black life does not matter. The 11 times Eric Gardner called out, I can't breathe, in 2014, and the 8 minutes 46 seconds the policeman choked George Floyd are significant in that they were captured on video and digitally circulated around the world. Of course, there are many, many, many other violent encounters between police and black people that are not recorded. There's something intensely affective and disturbing of watching black death again and again in the intimacies of our screens and social media. After a while, we couldn't watch anymore. We're not desensitized, but the horror of repetition of viewing black death is too much. The videos act as a scene from lynching or watching lynching. And also the videos act as a witness to the killing of black life again and again. To view these videos is an act of mourning, or can be an act of mourning, to remember life, to remember black life matters. Mourning, more precisely, incomplete or interminable mourning, is an act of remembering, of collective memory. In these cases, through the chaotic networks of globalized communication and algorithmic info-capitalism. The refrain, I can't breathe, is an act of remembering and a rallying call for the protest, not a demand, not as a demand, but a generalized historical memorialization of the racist atmosphere in which black life tries to live and breathe and dies. This is the sound of resistance that is echoing around the world. It's the move from grief to grievance that is of interest here, the move from grief to grievance. It's about questioning the linear temporalities of racial progress by remembering the violence injustices of the past for redemptive futures of hope. That was the first part, I can't breathe. 2, COVID-19. I can't breathe is also maybe the more hidden, silent cries of those who died from respiratory failure from COVID-19. As we know, that at least in the UK and the States, the virus disproportionately killed people of colour. To the extent that you could argue it's close to a kind of eugenics program to kill the old, the sick, the migrant, the poor. Black and brown life does not matter. If we put COVID in the context of a broader contemporary situation, we see a kind of quite a wide field of racism across the body politic. So in COVID in relation to, for instance, the hostile environment to migrants, the detention of refugees and migrants, the Brexit and the xenophobia release, the legitimacy of fascism, Islamophobia, the Prevent campaign, the Windrush scandal, institutional racism in all sorts of legal, political, welfare and the university, and Grenfell. As one of the cries from Grenfell was, we can't breathe. and it was a telephone call that was not answered. In one sense, I want to suggest we're witnessing a complete breakdown in the sort of national settlement between race and the political establishment. The underlying UK racism is in the open. What many of us have been saying for over decades, it has been and continues to be the lived condition of black and brown life. It's always been, there's nothing new here. The numerous protests for Black Lives Matter in the UK are about remembering past injustices of police and state violence, of institutional erasure, of everyday racisms, as well as the continual death of black people by the police in the UK and US. 3, social organisation and planning. What's significant about the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, in the UK, and around the world is that they're largely self-organised. There's no central group or committee organising them. In the States, they appear to be spontaneous, an immediate reaction to another brutal police killing. But as Robin Kelly has recently said, that in fact, a lot of work has been done understanding, studying, planning, and organising the demands for Black Lives Matter. The argument, for example, for abolitions of the prisons complex, the police, and the carceral state, and for anti-capitalism in general, has been developed over time. The notion, for example, of defunding the police did not just appear on signs spontaneously. It was already been articulated in local groups, in study sites, in organisations. In the UK, most organised left groups and parties have very little to do with the protests, including the Labour Party. The very youthful interracial composition of the protesters are very local, self-organised, in many cases led by feminists, networked in various ways with local groups, etc. And the demands for justice are being articulated outside of institutional political form. In a sense, the globalization of the Black Lives Movement is actually very similar to the politicization of the young people in relation to climate change and environmental protests. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the politicization of Black Lives Matter is actually already young people, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, who are being politicized through the environment, and they've kind of expanded, in a sense, what the environment means, or filtered it through for racial justice. The demands are not demands to be filled of the protest there, but they're changing the discourse. It's not anymore, I would argue, about quality, diversity, and inclusion. It's about racial justice, redemptive justice, decolonization as historical justice. And as others have spoken about, I think the strength of the Black Lives Movement is actually structured through self-help, mutual aid, community, religious and social groups. It's around social care, for instance. It's quite central to the way the Black Lives Matter movement and other kind of groups in the UK, for instance, are functioning. Very quickly, 2 more points. One is monuments as public memory, I said deconstructed. The pulling of statues, memorizing empire, slavery and colonial violence and death are acts of remembering those violent histories of the killing of black and brown people in their millions. They're about challenging the mythologies of British nationalism. Mourning of historical black death is the manifest in the performative event. The pulling down of the statues is a form of kind of joyous carnivalesque destruction. In some sense, it's quite similar to the angelic religious funerals, in particular in American Baptist black churches. It's a form of memorial to black death, which is a lament, a libation. It's one of justice, of freedom, fugitivity, and the memorial is also one of joy. And it can be understood in terms of, for instance, what Laura Harris calls the aesthetics of black sociality. I want to suggest the aesthetics of black sociality is the political form of BLM. And finally, political mindfulness. Unlike political mindfulness, which I argue remains tied to the ideas of the individual, the self and subject, as well as Enlightenment political ideals of citizenship and representational democracy, I would like to consider the Black Lives Matter movement, the protest for racial justice, as forms of social self-organization that are actually closer to orthodox Buddhism and not the neoliberalized Western mindfulness project. The crucial aspect of Buddhism is that there is no self. There's no self. There's nothing. Right? The breath is never a singular breath, but a collective breath that forms the social, the everyday networks and connections. I Can't Breathe is the phonic matter for Black social life, standing in for the multitude of struggles across the world. The racist mythologies of public memory of nation is interrupted by the social memory of the everyday mourning and by invented, improvised lives produced from nothing, or at least very little. These protests call into question the temporality and the form of the political. It's also a reminder, a trace of a history and a life, the alternative party, the blues, as a celebration of poor working class existence, friendship and sociality under the pressures of racial capitalism. It is the poetics of sociality beyond the limits of the political. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Ash. There's so much in there, and I just thought it was so elegantly woven together. I think your ideas, especially around how young people are perceiving these joint crises and how they understand kind of implicitly the interconnection between them, and how we can also work to sort of support and interconnect them such that they amplify one another rather than seeming like a lot of disconnected things. Because I think for a lot of people who are involved in many movements, they deeply feel that they are. So your kind of point about connection was neatly summed up, and also the way that your 5 points connected, which I thought was really, really powerful. So just bringing it on to our final speaker, Lynne. To kind of also bring us back to kind of weaving these strands back together from what people have said. I mean, there's so rich and so much in there, and I'm really keen to get to the questions because I feel like a lot of people on the call will have comments. But Lynne, over to you. I will unmute you. There you go. Sorry, 1 second. I think I need to ask you to unmute and then you need to agree. Very democratic in that sense. Yes, okay. Perfect. We can hear you now. Brilliant.
Okay, thanks. So moving, Ash. And I've enjoyed all the presentations, and I admire the mindfulness book, though personally I felt too close to the goals of the McDonnell-Corbin project to contribute. Now today, following on from others, I want to say a little bit more about care. This is because I've been in a small care collective for a few years now, which began as a reading group aiming to understand and address all the multiple crises of care. And later, given the extreme amounts of carelessness we saw all around us long before COVID, both from the local and the global, we decided we had to write a manifesto. So this manifesto is being raced out by Verso and will be available in 3 months. Like others then, we begin with a detailed discussion of just how the current crisis has come about, linking it, of course, like Dick and others have, to the decades of neglect generated by neoliberal policies, always prioritizing profit over people. Years of austerity, deregulation, and privatization, again, as Valerie describes, accompanied something else, though, the age-old, but recently hugely exacerbated devaluing of and disdain for care itself, disdain for care work in all its manifestations. And it was all this, of course, that diminished the ability of neoliberal nation states, especially countries like us or the US or Brazil, to cope swiftly or effectively with the spread of COVID-19, resulting in the now estimated 65,000 excess deaths in this pandemic in the UK, by far the greatest in Europe. But this crisis of care isn't new. It's been with us for a very long time now, with so many people lacking either the time or the resources to care for others adequately, even to care for themselves. That self-care that mindfulness wants us to do, but only certain people will have the time or resources to engage in self-care. So it's been expanding for years and only heightened since the savage cuts following 2010. Almost everyone outside the wealthy is aware of the problem, whether it's time and resources to care for their own infants, children, youth, or dependent elders. The crisis now so evident surrounding old people in social care is only the most dramatic and the most predictable of the crises. This is just the most glaring, for example, of the rampant carelessness everywhere in an era rightly described by Danny Doyling as peak inequality. Everywhere, the least well off, especially those with dependents in need of care, have been suffering, and suffering a lot. Now, this all ties in with the contempt and devaluation of so-called dependency, especially anyone in need of any state support, which Thatcher encouraged, a framing that has remained ever since, with much mainstream media vilification of those on benefits. You'll all be aware of Benefit Street and so on, and a complete disavowal of the ways in which, in one way and another, we are all dependent on each other, and all dependent on our basic social infrastructures supporting our general welfare. All our lives, we have these dependencies. So in our manifesto, or indeed we could be using the political mindfulness Phil and others discuss, we describe how this issue of dependency and autonomy are just two sides of the same coin. Also, our manifesto takes a very expansive notion of care. We draw upon leading scholars of care, such as Joan Tronto, many feminist economists and others, to suggest that care is not just hands-on care, but caring for and caring about the well-being of each other all the time, through to caring about the world itself, caring about the environment, caring about its sustainability. And this is all located in descriptions of our dependence on each other and our dependence on the need for a sustainable world, for sustainable infrastructures that we can't really exist without. So we discuss as well how and why caring work, both paid and unpaid, has been so routinely exploited, addressing, of course, its gendered and racial history, its long gendered and racial history. Those providing the services we most rely upon, whether for care or whether for the essential services we all need, have so often been the least respected and the least rewarded. There's almost an inverse relation between our need for the jobs being done and the respect and rewards they receive, which is why, of course, the text Political Mindfulness is dedicated to those workers. The skills of caring, like much of our needs for care, is constantly disavowed as any sort of skill, as any sort of real need, except amongst the elderly. So this is, and these two are connected. For care itself is actually a complex thing, often full of conflicts, and we need to see how easily it can generate ambivalence and tension, which is one reason people often shy away from it. And it's also why care must be valued and shared publicly and simply no longer tolerated as an exploited form of labour, shouldered mainly by women and by the poor, and especially, of course, and increasingly for many years, by ethnic minorities, often immigrant ethnic minorities, and appallingly badly paid and appallingly insecure. So, as in political mindfulness, we suggest that surely in this particular moment of rupture, in the wake of COVID-19, facing all the devastations of climate change that are here today, not just coming tomorrow, but already with us, but worse tomorrow, entering global recession as we will be, surely it might become a little easier for more of us to acknowledge something that has simply always been true, beginning from accepting our mutual interdependence and our shared vulnerabilities, whatever our age and whatever our situation. It's just that the affluent largely have their caring needs met. Indeed, they employ any number of carers, and they see those carers as dependent on them for their wages rather than them as dependent on the carers. But so many do not have their caring needs met, or worse, so many, as highlighted devastatingly by Ash in Black Lives Matter and so on, or in the refugee struggles globally, so many are routinely left outside of any structures of care, or worse, far worse, are rendered targets of abuse and violence and perhaps death, their lives at risk, their deaths hitherto publicly unmourned, or sometimes their deaths even welcomed. This all accompanies, we know, the wider misuse and abuse of the world's resources, accompanies climate calamities already upon us, which are still being sidelined wherever possible. So, in summary, in rejecting all this extensive carelessness, which has been with us for so long and is so increasingly evident today, we propose a model of universal care. Universal care. Once we had a care winner, we had a male breadwinner, then we had men and women both being breadwinners, but now we want universal caretakers, universal care, calling for inventive forms of care at every scale of life. And so we look at all those different scales of life. We propose expanding kinships through our notion of promiscuous care, the sort of care we saw taking place and dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis, or indeed some of the mutual care that we see today. But all this is dependent upon building communities, there actually being communities around us to support us in our individual and interpersonal caring work, and communities that can be strengthened by cooperative and public ownership. Because caring values and market values simply never fit together adequately. To care adequately, you need time, you need resources, you need flexibility. That is exactly the opposite you get in most market provisions for care, particularly in those corporations like Care UK, who've been busy not providing it, but whom we're still outsourcing our care to. So we argue that genuinely valuing care involves reinvigorating welfare states, rethinking as well as reinvigorating welfare states, not the old top-down welfare states, but community-led, democratic provision of welfare, and also creating alternatives to these corporations and capitalist markets that have invaded so much of our caring life. So we set about envisaging a world in which care simply informs all our relationships, from the most intimate through to care for distant others, to our relations to the natural world and to the planet itself. So I think perhaps this links up with what most other people have said. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynne. One of the things that I don't like about Zoom events is that you don't get any kind of applause. Although I know that a lot of people want to applaud what you said, as all of the other speakers. I kind of just want to acknowledge how rich the discussion has been tonight. And certainly something I took out of that is actually something that Ruth Lister, who is on the call tonight and was one of the authors of the paper, thinks a lot about. Is also this question of the interconnections of time and care, which we try to also weave through a lot of our work at Compass. We're thinking about UBI and thinking about how we create those conditions for care. Because as you say, it's something that cannot be added on as an afterthought. It's something that has to be sort of primal in terms of how we approach sort of the way that we set up society. And the second thing I wanted to say was also something that I've experienced during the lockdown is also a lot of that care coming to the surface in a very literal way sometimes, of seeing people on Zoom, you know, with small kids, or saying that they had to go and check in on elderly neighbours or relatives as part of their working day. So it was really good that actually, as feminists have always pointed out, the personal is political, but having that really obviously there, literally on Zoom sometimes, the care responsibilities being visible, I think has helped shine a light on the fact that a lot of people live these very versatile lives and have these many different roles, which was something I wrote about in Compass's Reasons for Hope publication, which you should definitely all check out in case you're needing a bit of hope at the moment. So without further ado, we've got 25 minutes left, and there's a lot of people on the call. So what I wanted to do, the way I wanted to take this was to take a few questions and sort of see how we go. And if we can fit in a couple of 2 or 3 rounds even, we will do. But what I'd like to do is give people the chance to ask questions. So you can do this in one of 2 ways. You can either put a little H or a little hand raise in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, which you can find usually at the bottom of your screen. So you can just raise your hand. So the chat is easier for me to see because there's so many people on the call that it's hard for me to flip between screens. So I would encourage you to use the chat, but if you want to raise your hand on the call, use the raise hand function as well. I'm going to take a few different questions and comments. Obviously, I'd ask you to just keep it brief if you can, and the speakers, when I come back to you to keep your comments, I'll just call on a couple of you who want to respond to that. So do I have anybody who wants to address any of the points that have been raised? Obviously, there are many of them, or ask a question of the speaker. I have Nora. So the one thing that I'm going to have to do is just move through. I need 2 seconds to just find you so I can unmute you. Nora, you should be unmuted now. Did that work?
Yep.
Brilliant. Go ahead.
I thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for all these wonderful talks. I really enjoyed them. It's not often you enjoy all the talks in a Zoom meeting. I just want to make a comment, which is also kind of a question. And it relates to the issue of making connections. I think that one of the problems, not in this round, but in the public discourses, is that we talk about the COVID-19 and don't forget climate change, and don't forget Black Lives Matters, and don't forget care. But I think what the COVID-19 is, it's like I don't know if you can say that in English, like a burning glass, where you can see how all these things are connected, because the pandemic is also a result of the exploitation of nature, of the killing of wildlife, you know, for not only for eating where people need it, but also for burning the Amazonas and then destructing the wildlife. And so these viruses that come from wild animals, they then jump over to human beings. So, well, I'm not going to describe it, but I think it's a real opportunity to understand even better and to talk about even more deeply about the capitalist form of production, not only as something that is profit oriented, but something that is based on death and killing of humans and non-humans. I'm not a Gamden fan in any way, but you know, already the good old Marx says productivity in capitalism is based on the destruction of the earth and the worker. And the pandemic is not something additional to this, but it's coming out of the same source of killing in order to make profits. And of course, then why care for people? Then why not defend your white privilege by killing Black people, and so on and so forth? I think we need to broaden our theoretical view in a way that we can really connect all these issues together. And that would also be a way to reach people like Valerie has said, you know, whom we're not listening to, because they are also part of that way of productivity that destroys people, human and non and humans and non-human.
Thanks, Nora. I think it's a strong theme that's emerging here from a lot of what people are saying about these interconnections and how we make these interconnections more explicit in what we do. I think that's a question we think a lot about at Compass in terms of bringing different groups together, but this has certainly been a session where that kind of unity around all of these interconnected woven strands, you can't look at one in isolation. But also as an actor, as a political actor, you can't just act on one, you have to act on many. I do think I'm happy to take a few more comments or questions for anybody, but I don't have anybody coming up or raised hand in the comments at the moment. So if not, I will ask one of the speakers, do you want to respond to what Nora just said? If so, just give me a little wave. I should be able to see most of you, or you can put an H in the chat like everyone else. Any of the speakers want to respond to Nora? Phil, sorry, didn't wave loud enough. Yeah, I've unmuted you. You should be able to speak now.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on that very useful comment from Nora.
Is your microphone on, Phil, or is it close? You sound very, very faint.
Can you hear me now?
That's a little bit better, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's something that we discussed a bit last week around the notion of political mindfulness, about what you keep in mind. And clearly there is a way of, for example, banging on about class, which just puts to the back issues of race or gender and so on. So I think the question is at two levels. One is how do you keep those connections, those interconnections in mind? How do you talk about them in a connected way? And it's not easy. It's not easy to talk about all these things all at once. Actually, usually talk about one, and then the other one, goes to the back. And those youngsters try and do this. They call it intersectionality, and I think that's more like box stuff. How I dealt with class, yes. How I dealt with race, yes. How I dealt with gender, yes. They don't actually, these categories are just sort of put there and then they're made to interact. They're not actually worked through dialectically. And I think that's one of the conceptual challenges we face. And then, of course, as Ash has brought out towards the end of his talk, there's the organizational question. How do we build partnerships, alliances? How do we build bridges between different interests, different groups, and so on? And the two obviously are interconnected. Again, what I want to say is political mindfulness that's what it's about, but it isn't easy.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's much easier than just saying, oh, they're all it's a complicated task to also give each space also their distinctiveness as well as the way that they're interwoven. You can't just pile everything in together because that's not respectful of the specificities of all of these issues. I wanted to invite Valerie to speak, and then I think I had Lynne with her hand raised as well. Valerie, I will unmute you. There you go. Should be unmuted now.
Okay. Yes.
Phil.
Thanks. Well, that was it was very, very interesting to me listening to everybody and also reading people's comments. And I was thinking, Lynne, when you were talking about the building communities that care for each other, of course, that is precisely what some of these South Wales communities that I've been engaged with did do. That was a central part of it. And I think one of the issues is precisely that they're being encouraged, let's say, in inverted commas, to be much more individualistic, and therefore to destroy precisely those aspects of connectedness which made life possible. So I think this is a very interesting aspect that we can begin to try to develop more about what that kind of caringness might look like, what it is already, and how it might be there. And I just so wanted to, somebody wrote in the chat, and I'm sorry it went by and I couldn't retrieve the person's name, so I apologize, but somebody commented that Asher's presentation was a necessary corrective to the melancholy of Little Britain Labourism. And I wasn't quite sure whether I was Little Britain Labourism in this comment. So I thought that actually that was, you know, we've all been talking about the connections, the specificity of particular struggles and issues, but also their complex interconnectedness. And so I would really like to suggest that we do need to look at these complex interconnections, because I don't know whether I was supposed to be the melancholy of Little Britain Labourism, but there are so many things that I object to in that formulation if it was describing what I was doing. Because although there's a backward look, I would not call it a melancholy if one were to, if that's implied as a kind of pathologizing category. And also Little Britain, oh, well, I can't stand Little Britain. It's one of the most horrible classist shows. And so I started to write down, well, you know, what Ash is describing is very positive in terms of a moment. So I wanted to ask, well, so why hasn't there been yet a massive uprising of the kind of people I was talking about who were saying no more? We won't have this anymore. You know, how come it took the form that it did of a support for Brexit or the Tories? How can we therefore look at the connectedness across those? Well, obviously one of them would be empire and racism, but I was trying to get a little deeper than that to try to understand the specificity and the emergence of certain kinds of movements simultaneously in the contemporary moment. I really feel that this is something that's such an important political task for us to do together. Not that I know the way to do it, but I do think we need to sit down and do it urgently. That's all I wanted to say, really.
Thanks, Valerie. And like when you were speaking, it also seems to me to connect very much with what Lynne was saying about bringing to bear care in all spaces, because that sort of care given back across movements often can breed that space and open up that space for it to be reciprocal rather than a caregiver and a caretaker. And I think that can happen amongst movements as an alliance, to build an alliance, as much as it can happen amongst individuals. Lynne, I was going to hand the floor to you. I should have unmuted you there. I think you have to there.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you. Yes, I agree very much with what Valerie and everybody has said. I don't think it's just seeing interconnections either. It's seeing how words either open up or narrow down in different periods, and that's what political mindfulness could be looking at. You know, a word like mutual aid, which is everywhere now, was only an anarchist word associated with trade unions a short while ago, and with anarchism. so that words sort of open up, just like the AIDS crisis gave us new words for care and mutual support. At this time, surely one thing we have to be doing is seeing how complex both resistance, struggle, and care for each other is. So Black Lives Matter is about resistance, but it's obviously about care for each other, care for ourselves, care for our Black selves, as Audre Lorde said. So it's always how to open up these terms to make them as radical and expansive, perhaps as radiant as we can. I mean, Sisters Uncut in Britain is the same. Sisters Uncut originally was about violence against women, but they, took up closing the prisons and all sorts of other issues, seeing it all as, a part of what it is to care for each other, to be concerned, to show solidarity. So rethinking all these terms, and not the narrowness of care being just simply, old people being cared for in caring homes and other people don't need to be cared for, or all the other ways in which language is closed down rather than opened up. We need new key words. A lot of key words that weren't in Raymond Williams. Care wasn't in Raymond Williams' text, for instance. So we do need to keep developing new key words as well.
Absolutely. Do I have anybody in the chat from amongst participants who want to signal that they want to speak? Any comments or questions to any of the speakers? Ruth, I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you. It's been really, really, as you said, a rich kind of conversation, Francis. I just wanted to go back to something that Ash said at the very end about mindfulness, and I absolutely take the point in relation to kind of instrumental forms of mindfulness that have become quite popularized. But for me, at least, genuine political or social mindfulness doesn't separate the individual. It's a way of integrating the individual and the social and the collective, rather than setting up the individual versus. And it doesn't have to be individual. There's a difference between starting with the individual and being individualistic. And I see that also when we talk about caring for each other, because there is an each and the other, the two. So I just really wanted to perhaps contest that, what seemed like a sort of either you've got to kind of go for the individual or you've got to go for the collective. That's all.
And it seems right that the idea of mindfulness is starting with yourself, but it's only the beginning, that it always has to interconnect and always has to reach outwards beyond that. Ash, did you want to respond to that? If so, I'll unmute you. One sec.
In practice, in what I would call a genuinely mindful way, it can't just be about the individual.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, partly it was just to have a little dialogue with Phil, really, in terms of, and also I was trying to just work through the idea of that in dominant practices, as you know, mindfulness is about individual resilience, actually, and it's about protecting the individual against all sorts of things, and I'm kind of sort of think, for instance, the traditions of Black politics are very much not organized around the individual. It's about the social, and the individual comes afterwards. So I suppose I am questioning the idea of a sort of liberal political philosophy of the citizen, the individual, the subject. I mean, these are all the sort of starting points, and I think that's probably the wrong point. I think we need to think more collectively, as not as a set of individuals, but a set of practices or ways of thinking together. So I think, for instance, I think planning and organisation is very important, and I think the idea, for instance, of everything is connected. That's true, but we've got to, and of course, we can't do it ourselves, right? I mean, what's valuable about Phil's project, in a sense, is because it's talking to other people. It's about 6 of us speaking or 5 of us speaking. It's not really, I don't think you can do it by yourself. That's the kind of first thing. And I actually think, for instance, in communities like communities around Black Lives Matter and certain things, that sort of work does go on, as it does happen in, in South Wales and stuff. I do think there's already traditions of collective practice that are happening. So I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. I do think it's about how it becomes articulated through various languages, etc. But there are traditions of care, and I suppose, and I think they are social, not individualistic. So I don't really, and I think mindfulness is really, really rooted in the individual. I know political mindfulness isn't, and I understand that, but there still is this relationship. And I want to sort of say, well, the individual is multiple as well. It's you're not a single thing. It's about practice, not necessarily me, and that's the kind of, those are political traditions. But I think it moves away from maybe a kind of an idea of kind of the subject, the self, which are very central to certain liberal political philosophy. And I want to think about other traditions. I mean, Buddhism is not right, because I think that's just slightly a kind of to bounce off in a sense. But I do like the idea of to think about what it means not to have a self.
Yeah, fascinating. I think especially also this question of the role that the individual plays, and to keep it in mind, but also to have it constantly in relation to other things. That's the difficulty about holding these things in some sort of creative sort of conflict with one another. I find as a tricky thing to work with, especially in the society which does prize the individual, and which we might push back against individualism, but as Reece said, not necessarily about starting with the individual. Did anybody else have a comment to make or a question? I think we've got time for one or two more comments or questions from the floor. If not, I'm going to ask the speakers if they had any more comments. And if not, I'm going to ask Phil to just, give us a little sense of where we go from here. And I'll also then round up at the end and just say how this is maybe interconnected, hopefully, with some of the work that Compass does as well. Phil, the floor is yours.
Well, it would be absurd to try and sum up this conversation.
I was thinking the same thing.
But I think, to take Ash's point, it's a dialogue. It's the dialogic imagination is what gets exercised. And that always involves listening in a different way, what isn't being said, imagining what our perceptions are not grasping, okay, the unspoken. That's why I think psychoanalysis comes in, because I think it's actually rather good at listening for what is unsaid and unspoken. And just to respond in a way to Ash, one of the things that I refer to in my essay is this movement of social dreaming. It was actually started by somebody who was working in who was working with organisations with a lot of conflict. And what he did was, instead of saying, well, the dream is about a private or individual psychodrama, he got people to come along and actually talk about their dreams. But he was interested in exploring what people's dreams had in common. What were the emergent themes? How actually sharing dreams in a group, in a fairly small group in this case, you would see how, if you like, a kind of collective unconscious was kind of emerging. But I think there are ways of coming in at this which don't fall back on this idea of a kind of isolated psyche, But I think to sort of flag that up, that I think there are ways in which we can push the whole notion in a different direction, which I think partly what this project is about. So I think in a way it's a conversation to be continued. I'm happy that that you've all come in and you've really made some very important and interesting contributions. I'm not quite sure where we go from here. I mean, people who haven't read the documents, please do go online to the Compass website and download them. And if you've got comments, please get in touch with us and we'll see where we can take it from there. So that's what I have to say. Yeah,
so I'll just wrap up and say massive thanks to our speakers. all of you have given me so much to chew on, and I think it's going to be a process of digesting. And so there's one thought that I had just to kind of bring that sort of strands a little bit together was the thing that I was reflecting on before this call is that mindfulness taught me a lot about where to put my attention. Sort of three lessons really from mindfulness I took that really came up in everything that people said was where to put attention, and that we have a choice in that practice of where we decide to put our attention, and that a lot of things clamour for our attention a lot of the time, but actually we have a choice about where we put it. And the second thing is something which is a lot about people holding many things at once and making space for them. And it doesn't mean picking and choosing, but it means expanding ourselves to be able to make more space for many things, and often conflicting and difficult things at once, which is something that I've also explored, been really interested to hear how people have come at that through the practice. And the final thing is, as a lot of people said, interdependence and care. Whether that's about the individual or the collective, that question of being linked up and being interconnected, and understanding things in the whole rather than in the singular and the particular has been really helpful for me. So I can only recommend people, if you enjoyed this conversation, to please do go and read both publications, which are excellent and really rich as this conversation was tonight. A massive thank you once again to the speakers, but also especially to Phil for organising this whole initiative. And the final thing is to say, please obviously do join Compass. We want to put on many more events of different kinds like this, and we're very much open to people coming to us with ideas of the sorts of events and the sorts of writing and publication we should be commissioning and running. So if you've got thoughts about things that you want to have events on or see publications on, or if you have writing yourself, please do get in touch. You can do that via our website, or you can email me at Francis, like the country with an S, at compassonline.org.uk. Thanks everyone for sticking with it for the whole time, and we've had such a good turnout tonight. So many thanks to all those participants who didn't speak but stuck with us for the whole session, which I'm sure you'll agree was incredibly rich and really thought-provoking. So please do go out and get a bit of vitamin D if you can, if you have that where you are. And we hope to continue this conversation. If you want to also write a blog post in response to any of this, do just drop us a line. We always really like to keep that conversation going. Meanwhile, thanks again to everybody. Enjoy your evening and good night.
Bye.